They had a small son too, but they had never ever seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dudley woke up on the dull grey Tuesday, it was a Tuesday. Our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dudley hummed as he picked out his most boring type of work, and Mrs. Dudley gossiped away happily as she wrestled at screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large dolly all flutter past the window. There was a large tawny owl. At 8:30, Mr. Dudley picked up his briefcase, pecked Miss Dudley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. Little Tyke chortled Mr. Dudley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4th Drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. There was a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dudley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Private Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dudley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dudley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Private Drive. No, looking at the sign. Looking at the sign, looking at the sign, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dudley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of trills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. There were a lot of people in cloaks. Mr. Dudley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people, he supposed. This was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dudley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. He was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him. But then it struck Mr. Dudley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dudley arrived at the Chronic's parking lot, his mind back on trails. forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the bakers. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single election tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in the back, that owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newcaster allowed himself a grin, most mysterious, and now over to Jim McCuffing with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Dad, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. We were as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks. But I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dudley sat frozen in his armchair, shooting stars all over Britain, also flying by daylight, mysterious people in clothes all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dudley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard about your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dudley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news. Mr. Dudley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. sure the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the boot holder back inside his cloak and set off down the street toward number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing he murmured. He turned on his heel and with his